Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. I'm just going to turn off this annoying ticker and get myself set up, make sure everything's working fine, and it looks like it is. So, hi everybody, and welcome to the Cosmia Book Club, April 2021, and an hour of discussion about this classic book, Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy. I'll be here for the next hour discussing my thoughts on this book, synthesizing some of the kind of critical analysis of the book that you can find elsewhere. And hopefully you'll join me in the chat so we can have a really good conversation about this really fascinating novel and hopefully find some interesting thoughts, some interesting ideas that we can all take forward as we read the novel in the future. So we've got about an hour's worth of streaming. Hopefully some of you will be dialing in. I'm going to keep a little eye on what's going on just on my little screen down here so you can see what's happening. The video of this will be uploaded in kind of better quality. There's some slight editing just for when I cough and sneeze and that kind of thing. In the weeks following this live stream, sometimes it takes me a bit of time to get around to doing the edit. So if you don't want to watch this live stream version back, which you can still do on our YouTube channel, then there's another option if you're just a bit more patient. And if you haven't commented live, then you can definitely leave comments and we can continue that conversation on YouTube in the future. So I've got 3 warnings this time about this book. The first is our traditional spoiler warning. We're going to be talking about what happens in this book. We're going to be talking about the characters in this book. So if you've not read it and you don't want to know and you don't want to think about it, then watch this on catch up when you've read it, if you're spoiler averse. There's also a trigger warning. A lot of pretty horrible things happen to characters in this story. So I want you to be really aware. I want you to do a bit of reading about this story if you've not, about this novel and what happens in it if you've not already, because it might just be a bit of a difficult read for people who've got lived experience of some of the events of this story. And finally, it's a bit of a content warning. I wasn't really sure going in what kind of novel this was going to be, but it's not a book for kids. So if you are a younger reader or you've got a younger reader you think might be interested, there is bad language, there is violence, there is some pretty horrible stuff that happens. So it's not necessarily the most appropriate for everybody. Right, that's all the disclaimers out of the way. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about a book that is a classic. We haven't done a lot of kind of traditional classics on this stream for a few reasons, I think, one of which is that what we're interested in is books that are coming out or have come out quite recently, and also books that I maybe haven't read before. But this is a classic I've never read. It's from a period that I haven't read a lot of, the 1970s. This book was published in 1976, and the author, Marge Piercy, has written 17 novels altogether, and this is one of the classics in genre fiction. She's also written about 20 volumes of poetry, a memoir, a really interesting and really well-regarded writer who's been doing this a long time. But this was one of the books that kind of pushed her into another level. She's from Detroit, went to University of Michigan and Northwestern, and very, very active in feminist, environmental, and anti-war causes, none of which I think are a surprise to anybody that has read this story. So I'm not going to go too much into the biography about Marge, and we normally talk a bit more about authors and their real life experience. I think if that's something that you want to get from this, then you should go away and do a bit of that analysis, because I think that'll be really interesting for you to find out more. What I want to get into more in this hour is what is this story about and what is it doing? Now, in terms of context, I think the 1970s is a very interesting period. Marge Piercy talks about this book being written over about 3 years, so we're looking at it being written from the kind of early to mid 1970s. This is a period following the 1960s and the explosion of hippie culture, of new waves of feminism and thought, thinking about getting back to nature, but also a kind of slight souring of those movements after the Second Summer of Love and the kind of violence and the backlash in the 1970s to what the 1960s had represented. So it's a really interesting time for somebody to be writing about the future, and particularly writing about a radical future. And that's what this story is kind of doing. Now, one thing that I find fascinating about this novel is what people can bring to it. It's been analysed as a dystopia, as speculative fiction, as realist fiction with fantastic episodes. You can analyse it as a utopia, as a cli-fi novel, really broad, which I think is really interesting. As I talk, I am going to apologise. I am keeping a little eye on what's going on the bottom of my screen here, just to see what is happening and making sure everything is working everywhere. So I'm going to take a brief pause so that I can see what's going on. You can see here that the stream is happening. I'm just going to share it on Facebook. If I can, let me see if I can do that, just so that you all know what's going on in the world. So a nice little pause to allow a few people to join the stream if they want to. If you are joining while I'm looking down, then I apologise, but you are very welcome. I'm just doing a little bit of sharing. So let me just have a little look. Share, can I share? Let me share. Options, share to a page, here we go. So apologies for that little interlude for admin. Okay, so let's get back to this. Right. So one thing that I'm very aware of is it's very daunting talking about a novel that is a classic. Classics have been analysed, they've been on reading lists, they've been published about. It's a very different thing in my mind to talking about a book that came out this year or last year, where it's fresh in people's minds. So this is going to be a slightly different book club in that I've got a bit more to go into of what other people have written about it. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I also still want this to be my take on the story. I want it to be your take on this story, because I think that's as valid as what somebody thought in the 1980s or the 90s. There is a benefit here in that there's been a long time, there's been 45 years for Marge Piercy to talk about this story. So we have got a couple of interview quotes that we're going to pull out as we go through, which just might help us illuminate what she was trying to do, and we can have a think about whether she was successful or if she was also doing other things that she wasn't necessarily aware of. The other thing that really leaps out to me at the beginning is that this novel is something really interesting that is unlike a lot of science fiction, I think. With some tweaks, and definitely with a modern writing style, this novel could have been published last month. What it's interested in is climate justice, it's interested in the policing of women's bodies, it's interested in economic instability and unfairness. It's got 2 or 3 elements of it which are depressingly as current today as they were when she was writing, and I think that's really interesting. Now, I think the writing style is very much of its time, but you could rewrite this year and it would make all of the end of year book lists in terms of being really interesting and really important. The other thing I want to point out at the beginning is that I made a decision early on in the thinking about how I was going to talk about this story, that I was going to consider that all the events of this story are real. I'm going to treat them as real as we come through, although we'll come back at the end, I think, to whether that's the best reading or other readings are also interesting. But in terms of how I talk about what happens, I'm going to kind of pretend that everything happens in here is real. So a very basic plot reminder. This is spoiler territory, everybody. The plot follows Connie, or Consuela Ramos, and her journey through both her present, which is New York of the 1970s, and futures that she can travel to. And what happens is Connie is someone that's really struggling. She's on the fringes of society. She's been in a mental health institution and has been released, but is struggling to make ends meet. She's really at the bottom of society in many ways. And an act of heroism on her part puts her back in an asylum, as it's called in the novel. As we would say today, kind of mental health hospital or a mental health institution. And in the lead up to this, she discovers that she can communicate with somebody from the future. They've travelled to see her, and when then she is in hospital, what she figures out is that she can also travel to the future in some way. We'll get onto that when we talk about time travel. When she's in hospital, she eventually is put forward for a radical trial, which is going to impair her mental function. And the story follows that kind of slow edging towards that event, and also following her exploring more about this kind of futuristic world that she's got access to. I realise as I'm talking about this that the plot is something that's quite difficult to elucidate in an easy go. It's not necessarily a plot that is a kind of propulsive one. This novel for me is as much a mood as it is anything else. There are other kind of plot points we could pull out, but I mean that's the basics of it really. Connie's journey in 1970s from home to kicking back against authority when they try to operate on her brain, and in the future, the plot is her learning more about that futuristic world and about how she can make changes to it, and things happen in that futuristic world, but not necessarily the same kind of structured journey plot as you might get in 1970s New York. So in terms of characters, as I mentioned, our main character is Connie, or Consuela Ramos. She is a Mexican American who is living in New York and has had a pretty tough life. And we see the world through Connie's eyes. We don't quite have it's not a first person perspective, but it's a third person perspective, which gives a real sense of what she's thinking all the time. So for most of the story, this is it's her narrative, it's her journey, it's her experience from her viewpoint. The other, I would say, main character, although I think this is an interesting question in this story, is Luciente, who is the futuristic person that Connie interacts with. We'll talk about person versus him and her a bit later on. And then we've kind of got three other constellations of characters that are surrounding Connie at various points. The first one of those is Connie's family, her brother Louis, and her niece Dolly, and in kind of flashback or in her memory, her husband, her daughter, family that have been in her life, and mostly taken from her life at various points. We also have a community which is in the mental health institutions. This is other inmates, her friends, Sybil and Skip, antagonists, people she just kind of interacts with. Also then the medical staff, the doctors, the nurses. And then that third community are the people that live in the future, the people that live in Matapozet, not just Viciente, but Jackrabbit and Bee and Barbarossa and all of those. So these three kind of communities that she interacts with at various points and has very different relationships with along the way. There's a surprisingly rich drawing of characters for me in a novel which is not short. It's not a novella, but it's also, I mean, we're looking at about 400 pages in my edition. It's reasonably big text. You get quite a lot of character here, and I suppose this is something that is really evident from this novel, is that it's a character-driven piece. I mentioned it's not necessarily a plot-driven piece, it's a lot more of a character-driven piece. So what you do get is that sense of the people in this story. They're all very richly drawn, they all have their unique characters and their unique interests. And I think that's really interesting. I read a review of this that said you can draw all these characters kind of from memory. They all stand out as kind of different personalities, which I think is really clever and really interesting. Okay, and we'll come back to that, I think, when we talk about the themes and about the kind of what occurs to me sections. So I kind of mentioned these communities, and really there are two settings of which we interact with characters for most of the story. The first one of those is in the kind of New York mental health hospitals, asylums community. And there are kind of three hospitals where Connie finds herself, where she interacts with some similar, some different people. We've got the original kind of institution, then we have somewhere in the country, and then we have a more modern hospital in New York itself. These are all different, but also similar. They're all kind of variations of the same mean and depressing and prison-like experience. And then we have the future setting, and the main one of those is this one village community, which is part of a township called the Mouths of the Mattapoisett, which is a village community modelled on the ideas of a Native American tribal setup that has been kind of modernised, that lives alongside other villages which have got their own kind of historically based cultures. And these are, in my mind, two villages. They both have their own customs, their own power structures, their own rhythms to navigate. And the first one, the mental health system, Connie's at an advantage. She's been through the system once before. And at least in the first two of those three places that she lives, the initial place where she goes to, and then in the country, she understands what to do and how to do it. It's somewhere she's very familiar with. And then the hospital is slightly different. The hospital is somewhere where she's having to learn how to navigate. And then we've got the future village, which has definitely got its own, completely to her, alien way of thinking and doing and operating. As in traditional with science fiction and fantasy, we see a different kind of community through that person's eyes. I think something that's really interesting about this story, actually, that it occurs to me, is that when the novel was published in the 1970s, in some ways the world that it was talking about was not alien to people. It was contemporary society. And the futuristic bit was the kind of alien place that we had to learn through Connie's eyes. I think maybe one of the reasons why it has done so well over such a long period of time is that it's written in a way that the historical bit, which to now to us is a long time ago, is still explained by Connie very effectively, which I think is really good. And I suppose also, especially when you look at the acknowledgements, Marge Piercy did a lot of research into the mental health asylum system in America of this time. So it's almost a piece of reportage. So perhaps that has given it a freshness, which means that we can hook into this in a way that we maybe wouldn't do otherwise. Last thing I want to say about settings is Something that I picked up on from a Tor.com article about this book by Joe Walton. There are no stories in utopia, there's just life puttering along. And I think this kind of ties in, I suppose, that initial kind of context for me and the setting. The utopian side doesn't have a story. The story is Connie's experiences of this utopia. But to some degree, it is a place without much going on. It's a place where people are, although there is action, people are just kind of living their lives. That the utopia that Marge Piercy has built is one where it's about life's everyday rhythms without a pressure for constant progress. And maybe there's a comment there about what that drive for progress means for contemporary society to us. Okay, that's settings. Mostly what I want to get into in this is themes and kind of things that occur to me. I've got loads of stuff in here. So if you've got comments on any of this, you can put them in the chat wherever you're watching this. I can put them on the screen then, or I can respond to them and we can get into a bit of a dialogue. Like I say, if you're watching this back on YouTube or Facebook afterwards, you can still leave a comment. We'll see it. We'll respond. We can carry on the conversation afterwards. So please feel free. If you don't want it put on the screen, then just leave a note to say, don't share this on the screen, and that's fine. And I'll see them all here on my little control panel. Okay, so themes. I thought we'd kick off with a big one, which goes back to Cosmia Festival 2019, utopias and dystopias. And I think something that we looked at the time with that is that you don't get a lot of utopias in science fiction. Maybe we kind of come back to that comment from Joe Walton. Utopias don't tend to have a lot of story, and what usually happens is that utopias turn out to be dystopias. We just don't realise that at the start of the story. I'd love to know your thoughts about whether you consider the future that Connie goes to be a true utopia, or actually it has got things in there that aren't quite right, because I'm not sure I've entirely got in my head quite how that fits. There's an interesting quote. There was a really nice article that Marge Piercy wrote for The Guardian to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the book coming out, where she talks about some of these themes. And she said in that article, during the heyday of the second wave of the women's movement, a number of utopias were created, and she kind of lists some examples. And now they aren't. Why? Feminist utopias were created out of a hunger for what we didn't have at a time when change felt not only possible but probable. Utopias came from the desire to imagine a better society when we dared to do so. When our political energy goes into defending rights and projects we want are created and now under attack, there is far less energy for imagining fully drawn future societies we may wish to live in. So she is very much saying that what she was interested in writing was a utopia. That's what she's trying to do here. She's trying to model something that is a positive future. And I think what is really nice about how she's done this is that she's managed to do it in a way that still has a bit of drive. It still has an interesting comparison. It's not about necessarily satirizing the present with a future, but it's a different kind of thing. And she says in that article, the point of a novel about the future is not to predict it. I'm not pretending to be Nostradamus. The point is to influence the present by showing where you can go. We're not good about predicting the future. The point is to get people to imagine what they want and what they don't want to happen down the road, and maybe do something about it. And there's something quite fascinating here about the events of the novel. When we look at the residents of the utopia, they've realised they can connect with people over time mentally, and then they can do a version of time travel. We're going to talk about motivations later on in this video, but I want you to think about, as I'm kind of building towards that, or as I kind of get to that later, whether we think the residents of that future society are doing this to people in the past. Are they presenting a utopia so that people in the past have got something to aim for? Not necessarily about the technology or about the science, but about saying, listen, if you keep struggling, this is where you can get to. I think Marge is kind of writing this partly in a period where that period of writing about utopias is already starting to erode. The kind of protection of what's been gathered is already starting to happen. So is this novel partly a vehicle of saying to people involved in the struggle, listen, this is the kind of thing we can be aiming for. Keep this in your mind. We don't want to go back to where we were. We don't want to have that life that Connie's living. We want to go for this other one in the future. Keep your energy levels up. So there we go. Now, there is a question here about whether it is a utopia, and also, I suppose, whether that matters. There's quite a lot on this novel on Wikipedia, and there were some bits there that I kind of wanted to pull up, I suppose. And the first thing it talks about is social transformation. So maybe we're moving here from utopia into some of the facets of what a utopia is or what a utopia wants to do. And I think that there are probably three areas of society that she's interested in, which the utopia and the story are looking at. The first one of those, Wikipedia calls social transformation, but I suppose I kind of mean environmental and economic changes, and kind of climate socialism, I suppose. It's how we look at the natural resources around us and how we use them and how we do that collectively. So that's the first one. I think the second one is about Wikipedia says feminism, but I think gender and identity is what we probably think about calling it today. And then the third one is about racism and about race in general. And all of these are incredibly resonant for a reader that's looking at this novel in 2021 and or last year. These are things that we're thinking about all the time as a society, but have kind of come to the surface in the last 2 or 3 years, which was thrilling for me reading this, feeling that resonance with what's going on at the moment. So let's start with that kind of political and economic transformation. We'll go in the order of Wikipedia, I suppose. So what we're kind of getting here is a social transformation of society after a kind of violent insurrection, finally tipped over by environmental degradation and then through to war. And I think the argument that she's making is that if there is a core of idealism and energy, people that are looking to make a change, when the moment comes, if they've still got enough faith, they can make it happen. That's my view on what's happening here. You might have a different one. Please leave it in the chat. It's the connection between personal action and historical change. And I think, considering that Marge Piercy was living in and had lived through, when she wrote this, a massive period of social change and of people advocating for new rights and for new ways of thinking about the world, that makes a lot of sense to me. What we get in this utopia is somewhere where everybody's got a say in how society functions. Everybody has a share of the communal wealth. There's something I suppose I've not talked about that I was going to mention at the beginning, which is the palpable anger that you get from this novel. You get an anger about the ways in which society currently functions, and I think society functions in some very similar ways now to how it did 45 years ago. And that anger is kind of palpable, the kind of unfairness of society. And I think that utopia that she's talking about is the kind of the salving of all the things that make Marge Piercy the most angry. And one of those is about how society is structured so that everybody can contribute, everybody can have a say, everybody can make a difference. I'd love to know what you think about that side of things. The second one, that second kind of big theme, which Wikipedia calls feminism, I think is about gender and identity. So Piercy does talk about her future not being a utopia because it's accessible. Every idea that's in it was an idea that was apart from the brooders, apart from the kind of the birthing pools, everything that they did, apart from some of the technology, was available in the 1970s. And the ideas behind this society are the encapsulating, modelling the ideas of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. I think this is a very interesting and very it's a take on a futuristic or a speculative world that you don't often get them quite so tied to a political or a social movement. So I think that makes this novel kind of stand apart from a lot of the other books that we've talked about, just how direct it is. The Wikipedia article suggests that there are counterparts between the kind of present world and the future world. So there is Skip, who's been put in an institution because he's gay, and then Jack Rabbit, who's bisexual and popular. The doctors in Connie's time are men, and in the future, women tend to be the ones who are doing the healing roles. And the positions of power rotate. There's no traditional parental power, which when you think about the scene with Louis and his children and the way that he is the kind of dominant bullying figure in that scene is really interesting. There is also something in this Wikipedia article about how the novel looks at the conflict between kind of feminism and commitment to motherhood and how that can be deconstructed, and maybe Piercy with the Brooders is finding a mechanism which would do that. I think something that's very interesting about this Wikipedia view is that it doesn't necessarily the novel's doing something more interesting with gender and identity here, I think. Because, and this is maybe where where I want to deconstruct this mirroring. Maybe that's a good way into it. So yes, Skip is been sent to a mental institution to essentially try and cure him of his sexual orientation. In the future, it's broader than just somebody being bisexual. There kind of almost is no sexuality in that way. There are no gender pronouns. These have been replaced by person and per. And this felt very, very contemporary to now in terms of writing for me. I kind of don't want to get too much into the kind of the details of all of that, because I think there's a lot for you to take from it personally. But I found that a really compelling part of the story, that it just kind of really wasn't a big deal. And we see it's not a big deal because it's a big deal for Connie. And Connie's resistance to this utopian world is most encapsulated in her resistance to the way that gender and ideas about gender have changed from her time. Going back to that argument that it's about the conflict between commitment to motherhood and feminism, Connie's someone that has defined herself by being a mother and a failure of a mother. And she's kind of she wants to get back to that place where she can feel like a good mother, perhaps. So to move to somewhere where that isn't part of society's makeup is profoundly disconcerting for her. There's a couple of other elements here about kind of female identity and gender, which I just wanted to pick up on. The first one of those, which is again very relevant for the last kind of year or so, is about women and the policing of their bodies. This is something that has been in the news a lot in the last kind of year or two, and it's something that kind of Marge kind of talks about in some of the writing she does, which is looking at the kind of erosion of rights, which you kind of get as kind of progress comes, and then it's kind of pushed back from people resistant to change in society. Women's choices about their own bodies is, particularly in Connie's time, is a strand that runs all the way through, and about her trying to reclaim a say in what she does and how she feels. There's that particularly horrific story about what happens to her when she has an abortion, and the just kind of sheer lack of control over even herself. That was incredibly emotive to me, and you get that kind of palpable sense of anger, I think, again, coming through. And then the last aspect we touched on a bit already is childbirth. So in this story, if you don't know or can't remember, women don't give birth anymore. There are brooders, which are essentially places where genetic material is mixed and then a baby is grown artificially, and then when born, 3 mothers of whichever genders want to get involved then raise the child. They're not necessarily genetically linked, they just look after the child. Now, I think Marge sees this as quite a controversial part of the story. I wonder whether we feel that way quite so much anymore. It felt to me that when you read it now, that idea has been perpetuated throughout lots of genre fiction. It didn't feel weird to me. It felt like a normal thing. It felt like just a kind of a trope of science fiction. So it's interesting that she still feels that that's controversial. I'm not sure. I'd love to know if you think that's controversial now. She did kind of note that if she wrote the novel again, she'd include a group that chose to give birth live, which was what she wanted to do in the original story, but she never put it in because of how long it took and getting all the structure right, and maybe it just kind of fell by the wayside as a note. I don't think the novel struggles for that, but maybe perhaps in some of the discourses that she wanted the novel to start, it would have been a useful thing to have as a counterpoint. And what it, I suppose, would have shown is that this utopia in the future, there is always a powerful element of choice. And as long as you don't hurt people, that people are allowed to kind of do what they want to do. As long as it serves the society and it doesn't hurt anybody, people can kind of follow their own story. So the final kind of element of this utopian vision and this utopian society is something that isn't necessarily massively picked up on in quite a lot of the discourse that I've kind of read about this story. It's not necessarily there in lots of interviews, but that's looking at the racism of the story. And this is something that's very palpable in the story itself. Connie is Mexican-American. She talks a lot in the story about how that influences her experience of the world, how her brother has tried to anglicize himself to kind of get ahead, and how that seems to be working. About how she's treated by people, about where she is in the pecking order of any scenario, whether that leads to some of the things that happen to her. And I think interesting that the utopian society is very deliberately tried to remove any risk of racism from the future. Now, one of the articles I read about the story did kind of pick up on this with a contemporary eye. One of the factors in that future utopia is that very deliberately ethnicity has been divorced from genes and skin colour. It's purely aesthetic. So there are communities who are based on older societies, Native American. What else have we got in there? There's the kind of Harlem. There will be all these kind of various types of what in the novel sometimes are described as primitive societies, but earlier societies, and particular ones that were interested in kind of cooperative agriculture-based communities or communes. Something very popular in that period, people looking at societies that do things differently and trying to draw out from them elements that might make our world better. So very of the period, I think. But you get that byproduct where genetic identity has gone. And that was uncomfortable for me, I think, particularly given recent conversations about appropriation, about the importance of heritage. Do we think that is utopian? Does it matter? Is it something that is an artifact of the time that if this was a modern novel might think about things slightly differently? Love to know your thoughts on this. It's such a thorny, difficult area, but one that this story helps us to think about. Okay, let's move off the heavy stuff a little bit. This is such a dark and heavy novel at times. I think it's easy to really get into those thorny issues. So let's move on to a different one, which is time travel. Hopefully a little bit lighter. So this is what Marge had to say in that article in The Guardian. I was weary of affluent white males hogging the genre, this is time travel genre, and I didn't feel they were the sort of visitors I would prefer if I were a future good society. When I was a child, I first noticed that neither history, as I was taught it, nor the stories I was told seemed to lead to me. I began to fix them. I've been at it ever since. We need a past that leads to us. Similarly, what we imagine we're working towards does a lot to define what we will consider doable action, aimed at producing the future we want and preventing the future we fear. So we'll start with a heavy bit and then we'll get on to the timey-wimey stuff. So really interesting take, I think, on who gets to be a time traveller. And yes, traditionally, it's your kind of male white scientists. Think about the time machine. Think about Fringe. Think about who those time travellers are coming back in time, at least. And this is Marge saying, well, actually, it's not necessarily about your achievements. It's not necessarily about your education. It's about being receptiveness. Anybody can do it. And in some ways, you kind of want people to go to the future are the ones that need hope the most. Who do you want to show a better future to so that they can start to think about it? Okay, that's the heavy stuff. Let's talk about time-winding stuff. Okay, so this version of time travel works as a kind of astral projection. There is a mental connection between two people, or one person, or groups of people, I should say, because there is a moment where there's kind of three of them in this mix. And when that bond has been made across time, then one person kind of travels to the other person's time. They manifest themselves, and at least in the future, the person that's travelled to the future is corporeal. They can interact with the world. They can eat. They can drink. They can couple, as the novel says, with other people. But they don't take on nutrients. We don't really get a sense of whether they can die. So it's a bit of a kind of interesting experience, I think. And I'm not sure it's one that's necessarily logically consistent. If people go back in time, it's a little bit unclear whether they can be seen or not, or interact or not. It feels like they can't quite so much. Because I think when Luciente goes back, she just kind of is supposed to warm the chair at the very beginning. But then when Connie is escaped from the hospital and she's trying to survive in the wilderness, she's got to go and get her own water and pick her own herbs and stuff. Luciente can't do anything for her. So it's a little bit vague and maybe not entirely consistent. What I would argue in this story is that it doesn't necessarily matter. I think it's sometimes in time travel novels, the fine details, if they're not consistent, they can undermine what the story's doing. But what we should be caring about here is the feelings and the emotions and the experience of doing this, not necessarily quite the ins and outs of it. This is a speculative novel. It's not a hard sci-fi time travel story. There is something interesting, though, about the novel's treatment of science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction and time travel. What becomes clear quite early on is that what Connie is doing is travelling to a version of the future, not a fixed one. And we'll talk about that in things that occur. But she's travelling to a version of the future. And because she's travelling to a version of the future, does that mean she has a little bit more reality there? Because it's not fixed. Whereas Luciente can't be a physical figure in the past because she's not real. She's just visiting. Whereas Connie is kind of stepping out of time and stepping forwards in time to some degree. I think that view of it might make a bit more sense, I think. I'd love to know what you reckon in the comments. So that's the timey-wimey stuff. Like I say, I don't think it's... I've left it till kind of this point because I don't think it's essential for the story. And as ever, I'm going to kind of finish on talking about things that occurred to me during the story. They tend to be what I put in my little notebook as I go through. We've already talked about the first one. We do get this kind of utopia a lot less often. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a utopia which doesn't seem to have many flaws. I want you to bear that in mind as we talk about some of these other ones. The next question, or the next thing I want you to be thinking about or give your view on, is this future real? There's a very interesting passage at the end, which is Consuela and Connie's, depending on how you want to talk about her. It's her kind of hospital records, where she's described as being schizophrenic. And there's something that we haven't talked about because there just isn't time in this hour. There's a passage where Connie sees herself as different people that are based on the different settings she's in, to different roles she's in. She is Consuela, she is Connie. She kind of deliberately describes herself as different people. Is this because she's had a psychic break and she is different people? Does an act of violence lead to a psychic break, which leads to hospitalization? And one of these personalities that she develops is someone that thinks she's in the future, when what she's really having is a seizure. Marge Piercy very deliberately leaves this slightly unclear. We only see, apart from that final bit, Connie's interpretation. And I think what's quite interesting and what clever is putting those notes at the end, having experienced the doctors in the story, their callousness, their lack of listening and their lack of paying attention to somebody physically, mentally, the treatment of patients as kind of laboratory animals rather than people. You immediately distrust any conclusion they've reached about somebody. They've got no idea about Connie's internal world. All they've got is the external sense of it that she wants to put out there. For me, that suggests that this is real, that utopia is real. She's having this experience. But it is slightly left unsaid. As I said at the beginning, I'm treating this like it all happened. Otherwise, it's not a science fiction, speculative fiction novel for me. It's just a novel. And this is a science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction festival. So we're going with it. Another thing that occurred to me, or that I was trying to consider, was why Connie? Why go back to Connie? And about halfway through, I made a note in my little book to say, why are they coming back? Why are they doing this? And about 3 pages later, I got an answer. I think perhaps Marge realised that this was the point in the novel where she had to start explaining that, or I was just very lucky. Why Connie? We'll talk about that in a minute. Who else are they going back to speak to? And what are their motivations? We'll start with why Connie. And Marge Piercy talks about this a little bit. She talks about about wanting to, as we mentioned before, about giving other people the chance to be time travelers that normally had that experience in science fiction stories. So I think that features in there somewhere. Who else is a more interesting question? I think they mentioned 5 people that they're currently communicating with. We never meet any of the rest of them. As far as we're aware, we don't meet any of the rest of them. And there's no sense really if they're all from the same time period. One thing that Luciente explains, or that they explain in the future, is that there are these kind of cruxes of time, these kind of points where things might go one way or the other. And she's at one of these. And what they're trying to do, perhaps, is try and make sure that the right future is picked. So you could read this cynically. Are the people of the future grooming Connie to kill the doctors? Or are they just trying to... and the motivation for doing this, I thought about this. The motivation is that the stalling of this kind of scientific progress means that people will then be ready to rebel when the time is right. They've just got to keep the hope alive. They've got to keep resistance alive for the moment when they can make a change, and that their world is the result of enough people being ready to do something else when the time comes. So they might be doing this in a benevolent way. They might have just be saying to as many people as they can in the past, listen, keep the faith, do what you do, it's all going to be worth it. This is what the future looks like. But more cynically, they could be identifying people linked to specific events like these doctors and their experimental surgery, finding the people involved to then say, listen, not deliberately, but you're going to have to do something about this. Barbarossa, one of the people that we meet in the future, talks about the shape of time and is a shaper. And these are people who the debate of the future is about whether genetic programming should be brought into place or not. So there might be some subtle links here which suggest that there's already been an argument, which is that this kind of shaping, this deliberate interfering in the past, is something that they, as a society, they need to do. And this is all just part of the reality of building the future they want. And as much as the utopian people are very open and very warm and very emotional and cooperative, there's a hard edge to them as well. And the hard edge is something that Connie doesn't investigate, even though we might want to do if we were there. And so let's talk about the ending. Did Connie succeed or fail? This is one of the open questions of the story. So success might be, in this kind of context of crux points and shaping of history, shutting down the experiment and just keeping humanity going long enough to eventually make a change. Or did she fail? And by fail, she lost her empathy. So Connie has been through hell, and right there at the future, she's had a moment, but she's retained her humanity. The Connie of most of the story is one who, despite being ground down, she's got hope for the future. She's got agency to make a change, But at the end of the novel, and she's receptive. She's receptive to communication with the future. She is, you could see her as being a model of humanity on the path to the humanity that we see in that utopia. But if that's the case, and if what they're trying to do is just inspire more people to be like them, then she's failed. Because at the end of the story, she's lost her empathy. And by losing her empathy, has she lost her connection to the future? Or have they lost interest in her because she's killed the doctors? It's confusing, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. One thing that I did want to point out, which I spotted, there is a moment in the story where they talk about the wandering players. This kind of festival of the past, where they kind of play act at the past, at historical events, even though they've kind of got them wrong. And one of the Wandering Players productions is called When Time Frayed, and it's set on one of the space stations. Now, does this suggest that there's been an incident which has fractured the fabric of space-time, which means that this kind of astral projection can now happen? Was this an experiment gone wrong? Or was this a byproduct of something else? The other thing I noticed is that when they're talking about going back in time, the way that Connie's friends from the future describe it as, we can't go back and change the past. And the we is italicized. And often, when it's a collective noun and it's italicized in the future, it's because they're talking about the people on Earth and the people in space. If they're them, it's an italicized them. So does this one kind of throwaway sentence and that Wandering Players script suggest that the kind of the dystopia, the dystopic future, have they been experimenting with time travel so they can go back and change the past? And then the way that they've done that means that they can. And all that the empaths, cooperatives on Earth can do is astral project, go back and try and kind of counteract. Which is fascinating to me, because if the kind of cyborgs in space who are fighting a war against humanity can go back in time physically to try and change things, that is basically Terminator. So did Marge Piercy invent the idea of Terminator? I'll leave that up to you. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I don't know if she would know the answer. There's just these little hints that you can pull out. So some final things to mention. We are going to go slightly over time. I hope that's okay with everybody. This will be edited down to a tight hour, so I won't worry about it too much. Some other little things that occurred. There was a lot of music and poetry in this. I think you can definitely tell that Marge Piercy was a poet as well as a writer. There's lots of stories. There's lots of music lyrics in here. It's not something I tend to enjoy in stories, so I probably haven't spent enough energy unpicking how relevant they are. If you've got theories and ideas on the music poetry, you leave them in the comments, because I need educating on that. Secondly, there are some brilliant lines in this, some really cool writing. I love this phrase quite early on. Ridiculous to live in a place where the taste of your own soul food was priced beyond you. Now, this is an interesting sentence for me. It's interesting because you can feel Connie's annoyance at that. It's something that is even more relevant today than it was then, the appropriation of cultures. But if Marge is sharing Connie's anger for that sense of appropriation of cultures, how can she also model a utopia where there is no soul food anymore? There is nice food, but everybody kind of shares the same kind of blanket culture. Love to know what you think about that one. Finally, There's a website called schmoop.com. That's SCHMOOP, two O's there, .com. They've got a little article about the story for kind of book clubs and teaching. They've got 5 questions that I think are interesting to consider. Would the book be different if it were about a man on the edge of time rather than a woman? Or would that undermine the book's point? What would it be like if the novel also got into other people's heads and you saw what they were thinking? Is Connie mentally ill? Why is the book not in strict chronological order? Why does that matter? And what do you think about the language of the future compared to the language of the present? Now, you know I love to talk about language on these. There just hasn't been time. We're already over an hour and I've not quite finished. I could do a whole video about the futuristic language here. All I will say in this short period of time is that I thought it worked really nicely. I think often futuristic language can jar incredibly. It's a very hard thing to do, to create slang. But I think it was close enough to how we speak, but far enough away, but thought through so that everything kind of made sense. I was kind of happy with most of it. There was a couple of things that maybe didn't quite work for me. But considering this novel was written 45 years ago, I think it did a great job of kind of keeping it reasonably outside of a particular historical period. Okay, so what I finish is just my reflections on the links of this story to other ones. Some have pointed out there's mirroring of structure here for Thomas More's Utopia. That's not a story I know, but using a futuristic utopia or a fantastical utopia to critique contemporary society, in Thomas More's case, the 17th or the 16th century, really, I can see how that quite works. There's probably also elements here of the time travel stories like H.G. Wells, but kind of satirizing those with a very different kind of hippie, open your mind way of doing things. There was also, not being a big reader of Margaret Atwood, I'm not going to comment on connections with Handmaid's Tale or anything like that. There are 3 other properties which I think make interesting counterpoints to this. One of which we've covered as part of Cosmia's video content before, Future of Another Timeline. The kind of battle for the future, the diverging timelines, the kind of radical feminism at the heart of it. They are a really interesting 2-piece, these stories. And I think if you're going to read this, and if you're not, then those 2 novels, I think back to back, would make for a fascinating dialogue. It's a similar idea, but done very differently. And I think that's something that I can see the debt that Future of Another Timeline has to Woman on the Edge of Time. We also have 12 Monkeys. I think that kind of mental health and time travel side, obviously 12 Monkeys is a very different kind of story, but I do think there were some interesting connections there thematically. And the final one is not a genre one. If you've not, I'd highly recommend you read John Ronson's Psychopath Test, which talks about the ways in which the mental health sector stigmatise people's mental health and try and categorise it and treat it with medication. And we're living in kind of the end game of what Connie's going through here. Not just treating people as if they're depressed, not offering people therapy, just medicating them and doing the wrong thing, not treating people who've got mental health issues as people, but treating them as kind of experiments, essentially. So I think there's some really interesting things in that non-fiction story that Marge Piercy was also exploring in the 1970s in the system that she's kind of tearing down. So that brings us to an end of this slightly longer book club. I hope that's not been too much of a problem for you. We'll be back next month with another story. If you want to support the channel, if you want to give us a little bit of income to help us pay for our streaming service and all the other bits and pieces, or just generally support the festival and how it runs, there is a link on the screen to our Ko-Fi. You can just leave a small donation there. That would be really appreciated, and it does help us, pay for all the bits and pieces we need to run this channel and to run the festival, which we make as free as we physically can. In the meantime, go and enjoy the sunshine if it's sunny where you are. Make sure to leave comments in this and continue the dialogue about this story. We'll stay safe, and we will see you next time for the next instalment. So for now, see you later.